The sample came through my checkpoint at 6:14 on a Thursday morning. And the reason everything happened the way it did is because I looked at the manifest, saw the discrepancy, and initialed the form anyway. That is the confession. That is where it starts. My name is Ryan Lee. For 4 years, I worked as a containment logistics coordinator at a facility most people know by its unofficial name, Area 51. The formal designation is Groom Lake Test and Evaluation Range, attached to the Nevada Test and Training Range under the jurisdiction of Edwards Air Force Base. My job was tracking the movement of materials between secure zones. Every sample, every piece of equipment, every sealed container that moved from one section of the underground complex to another had to pass through a checkpoint staffed by people like me. We verified classification tags, matched serial numbers to manifests, checked temperature seals, and confirmed that the receiving lab had submitted a valid transfer request before anything moved. It was clerical. It was repetitive. It was the kind of work that makes your brain flatten after the first 2 years. But the facility existed because that flatness, that boredom, was the point. If someone like me waved through every container without reading the tags, the whole chain of accountability collapsed. The system depended on people who would stop, read, compare, and refuse to pass anything that didn't match. On that Thursday, I stopped. I read. I compared. And the manifest for container NTF 7734 listed a weight of 4.2 kilograms. The transport pod sitting on my counter weighed 6.1 kilograms, according to the built-in scale. A 1.9 kilogram discrepancy, nearly half again the listed weight. Standard procedure was straightforward. Flag the discrepancy, hold the container, notify the originating lab, and wait for a corrected manifest or a physical inspection. I had done it 11 times in the previous year. Each time, the discrepancy turned out to be a clerical typo, a miscalibrated origin scale, or an undocumented secondary sample added to the pod at the last minute by a researcher who forgot to update the paperwork. 11 times, and 11 times the flag produced nothing but irritation from the scientists and a 20-minute delay. The receiving request for NTF 7734 came from Dr. Noor Hassani's lab on Sublevel 4. Dr. Hassani's team worked with recovered materials. That was the polite, vague term used across the facility for objects and substances that had been collected from sites the rest of the world was never told about. Crash sites mostly, though I only learned that later. At my clearance level, I knew that recovered materials existed, that they were biologically and chemically sensitive, and that their classification ceiling was above anything I would ever be read into. I did not know what they were. I did not know where they came from. The system was designed so that people at my level never needed to ask. Dr. Hassani had submitted the transfer request at 5:50 that morning, 24 minutes before the container reached me. The request was clean. Her digital signature was current. The classification tag on the pod matched the tag on the manifest. Everything aligned except the weight. And I thought about the 11 previous flags, the 20-minute delays, the irritation, the way Dr. Hassani's lab assistant, a quiet man named Philip O'Dara, had once stood at my counter for 35 minutes while I waited for a callback, and the way he'd said very politely, "Ryan, you are the only person in this facility who treats a typo like a bomb threat." He hadn't been wrong. The other coordinators on my shift, there were 3 of us rotating, let small discrepancies slide all the time, especially for established labs with clean track records. Dr. Hassani's lab had never once produced an actual security concern, not once in 4 years. So I initialed the form. I logged the weight as 4.2 kilograms, which was the manifest weight, not the measured weight. I pushed the pod through to the receiving tunnel, and 20 minutes later, Philip O'Dara signed for it on Sublevel 4, and I moved on to the next container in the queue. If I had flagged it, The pod would have sat in my holding cage until an inspection team verified the contents. That inspection would have happened within 2 hours. The discrepancy would have been investigated. Someone with a higher clearance than mine would have opened that pod and seen what was inside it alongside the documented sample. And maybe, I don't know, maybe things would have gone differently. Maybe the additional biological material packed against the primary sample would have been identified before it interacted with the cultures in Dr. Hassani's lab. Maybe containment would have held. I can't know. Nobody can. But the sequence is there, and my initials are on it, and the timestamp reads 0614. The facility at Groom Lake is not what most people imagine. The surface structures, hangars, barracks, the long runway, the motor pool, account for maybe 15% of the operational space. The rest is underground. 3 sublevels connected by freight elevators, personnel lifts, and a series of hardened corridors that branch and rebranch like a root system under dry soil. Sublevel 1 houses administrative offices, server rooms, the main communications center, and the security operations hub. Sublevel 2 holds engineering workshops, materials testing bays, and a large vehicle maintenance garage used for specialized equipment. Sublevel 3 and below is where the classified work happens. The biological labs, the physics research suites, the long-term storage vaults, and a handful of spaces I never entered and whose purpose I was never briefed on. The desert around the facility is functional emptiness. 130 miles of restricted airspace in every direction. Groom Lake itself is a dry lakebed, flat and white and featureless. The nearest public road is more than 20 miles from the outer perimeter fence. The nearest town, Rachel, Nevada, is a scattering of trailers and a single bar. Getting into the facility requires either an authorized aircraft landing or a road that passes through 3 separate checkpoints, each staffed by armed security police and monitored by ground sensors that can detect a vehicle from 6 miles out. Getting out requires the same process in reverse. The isolation is the point. Everything about Groom Lake is designed to keep the world out and the contents in. I understood that when I took the job. What I did not understand until much later was that the isolation also meant that when something went wrong inside, there was nowhere for the wrong to go except deeper in. The first sign came 9 hours after the container passed through my checkpoint. I was back in my quarters, a small room on Sublevel 1, shared with another logistics coordinator named Darnell Quinones, when the overhead intercom pulsed 3 tones. 3 tones meant facility-wide advisory, non-emergency. Darnell was lying on his bunk reading something on a tablet. He didn't look up. "Probably the ventilation again," he said. The HVAC system on Sublevel 2 had been cycling irregularly for a week, and every time the maintenance team ran a diagnostic, they broadcast an advisory so personnel wouldn't worry about the air quality sensors spiking. But the message that followed was not about ventilation. "All personnel, Sublevel 4 Laboratory Corridor B is under restricted access effective immediately. Badge authorization for Corridor B is suspended pending further notice. Personnel currently in Corridor B should report to Checkpoint S4 East for credentialing verification. This is a precautionary restriction. Normal operations continue in all other sections." Darnell looked up. "Corridor B. That's Hassani's wing." I didn't answer. My stomach had done something it hadn't done in years. A cold drop, like missing a step on a staircase. "Probably a spill," Darnell said. "Or one of the containment hoods threw an alarm. Happens every few months down there." He went back to his tablet. He was right that it happened every few months. Minor containment alerts in the biolabs triggered restricted access while cleanup and verification took place. The language of the advisory was standard. The 3-tone pulse was standard.
Nothing about it, taken alone, would have justified alarm. But I knew what had gone into Corridor B that morning. I knew the weight was wrong, and I had not flagged it. I sat on my bunk for about 40 minutes, doing nothing, telling myself the same things Darnell had said. Spill, hood alarm, routine.
Then I got up, went to my shift terminal in the logistics office, and pulled up the tracking log for NTF 7734. The pod had been received by Philip O'Dara at 0638. It had been logged into Dr. Hassani's primary containment suite at 0652. No further movement entries, no flags, no subsequent transfer requests. I stared at the screen for a while. Then I closed the log and went to eat dinner. The second advisory came at 11 that night. 4 tones. 4 tones meant facility-wide advisory with action required. Darnell was asleep. The intercom woke him, and he sat up fast, feet on the floor before his eyes were fully open. All personnel. Sublevel 4 is now under full restricted access. All Sublevel 4 personnel are directed to remain in their current locations and await guidance from security team leaders. All other personnel should remain on their assigned sublevels. Badge access to elevator banks E3 and E4 is suspended. This is a precautionary restriction. Further updates will follow. The word precautionary again. But the rest of the message had escalated. Full sublevel restriction, elevator suspension, shelter in place for everyone below. That's not a spill, Darnell said. We both got dressed. Neither of us had anywhere to go. Our shift didn't start until 6 o'clock, but neither of us could lie back down. We walked to the logistics office. 3 other people were already there. Janet Murayama, who ran the night shift, a transport driver named Keenan Birch, and a security police staff sergeant named Tomas Fierro, who had come in from the surface checkpoint to ask if anyone knew what was happening below. Nobody knew. Janet said the comm center had gone to reduced external traffic at 2200, which meant outgoing messages were being queued and reviewed before transmission. That was unusual. It happened during classified test events, weapons tests mostly, but there was nothing on the test calendar for this week. Someone on 4 probably broke something expensive, Keenan said. He was leaning against a filing cabinet, drinking coffee from a thermos he carried everywhere. Last time they locked down a sublevel, it was because someone dropped a sample rack worth $3 million, and they didn't want anyone walking through the cleanup zone. Last time they locked down a sublevel, they didn't suspend elevator access, Janet said. Maybe the elevator's broken. Both of them? Keenan shrugged. Staff Sergeant Fierro said nothing. He was checking his radio, cycling through security frequencies. After a minute, he put it down. Comms are on restricted channel protocol, he said. Everything's encrypted to team lead level. I can hear traffic, but I can't read it. We sat in the logistics office until 100, talking about nothing, waiting for the next advisory. When it came, it was not an advisory. It was a direct instruction. All Sublevel 1 personnel, report to designated Assembly Point Alpha by 0130. Bring personal identification and facility badge. Leave all personal electronics in your quarters. Compliance is mandatory. Assembly Point Alpha was the large briefing room near the north elevator bank. When Darnell and I arrived, there were already 60 or 70 people inside, sitting or standing in loose rows. The room could hold 200. It smelled like recycled air and nervous sweat. Colonel Vivian Lusk stood at the front. She was the facility's deputy operations commander, a tall woman in her early 50s with a reputation for clarity that bordered on bluntness. I had interacted with her exactly twice in 4 years, both times during routine compliance reviews. She looked tired. Not frightened, but tired in a way that seemed out of proportion to the hour. At approximately 15:30 today, she said without preamble, Dr. Hassani's research team on Sublevel 4 experienced a containment event involving a biological sample. The nature of the event is classified and will not be discussed in this briefing. What you need to know is that Sublevel 4 is sealed, that the situation is being managed by a specialized response team, and that our priority right now is maintaining operational discipline across the rest of the facility. She paused. The room was very quiet. Effective immediately, the facility is under internal lockdown. No personnel will transit between sublevels without escort and authorization from security team leaders. Surface access is restricted to essential logistics only. External communications are suspended except for command-level traffic. These measures are temporary and proportional. Someone in the back, I couldn't see who, asked how long.
Until the response team on Sublevel 4 confirms containment, Colonel Lusk said. That is the only timeline I'm going to give you. Go back to your quarters, stay on your sublevel, and wait for further instructions. Questions will be answered through your section supervisors. Dismissed. We filed out. Nobody spoke much. The corridors on Sublevel 1 felt different after that. The same fluorescent lights, the same gray walls, the same recycled air, but all of it carrying a new charge, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the pressure changes and you can feel it in your teeth. Darnell and I walked back to our room. He closed the door and sat on his bunk. Containment event, he said, involving a biological sample. That's what she said. Ryan, they sealed an entire sublevel. They cut the elevators. They pulled external comms for a biological sample. I didn't answer. My mouth was dry. What kind of sample requires all that?
The kind that weighs 1.9 kilograms more than its manifest says it should. I didn't say that. I sat on my bunk and looked at the wall and felt the cold drop in my stomach again. Deeper this time, like the step I'd missed was actually a floor, and the floor was gone. By the following morning, the facility's atmosphere had shifted from tense to strange. Meals were served on Sublevel 1 as usual, but the cafeteria staff seemed smaller. 3 people behind the line instead of the usual 6. The food was the same pre-packaged, reheated government fare, but the portions were slightly larger, as though whoever was managing the kitchen had more inventory than mouths to feed. Janet Murayama told me during breakfast that 4 members of the night maintenance crew had been reassigned to Sublevel 2 overnight and hadn't returned. Their quarters were empty. Their personal items were still there. Reassigned where? I asked. Nobody's saying. Their supervisor got a direct call from security, and they left. That's all anyone knows. After breakfast, I went to the logistics office and tried to pull up the tracking system. My terminal was locked. Not my personal login. The entire logistics database was inaccessible. A yellow banner across the screen read, "System under administrative hold. Contact your section supervisor for information." I contacted my section supervisor, a civilian named Greg Palafox, by walking to his office 2 corridors down. His door was open. He was sitting at his desk, staring at the same yellow banner on his own screen. "Don't bother," he said when he saw me. "I've been trying to reach Colonel Lusk's office for an hour. Her aide says she's on Sublevel 2 and unavailable." The whole tracking system is down? Every database that touches Sublevel 3 or 4. They've firewalled the entire lower section. I can still access Sublevel 1 and 2 logs, but everything below is dark. Greg, has that ever happened before? He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Greg Palafox was 58 years old. He had been at Groom Lake for 11 years, longer than anyone else in logistics. In all that time, through test events, security incidents, and 2 actual fires, he had never seen the database firewalled. "No," he said, It hasn't. The next 48 hours dissolved into a kind of structured emptiness. We were told to maintain normal schedules, but there was nothing normal to do. The logistics office was useless without its database. The transport drivers had no movement orders. The cafeteria served meals at regular intervals, but the roster of faces eating grew slightly shorter each cycle. People were being pulled, quietly, individually, without announcement, to Sublevel 2. They didn't come back. Darnell was pulled on the second day. A security police airman came to our room at 1400 and told him to report to elevator bank E1 with his badge.
Darnell looked at me, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen before.
Not fear exactly, but the recognition that whatever was happening had stopped being abstract. "Probably just need extra hands for something," he said. "Probably." He left. His bunk stayed empty. That evening, I found Tomas Fierro in the corridor outside the briefing room. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, which was unusual for someone as disciplined as him. His radio was in his lap. "They've started sending people to the surface," he said without looking up. "Small groups. Trucks heading south toward Indian Springs." Indian Springs, now Creech Air Force Base, was about 40 miles south. It served as a secondary support installation. "Evacuation?" I said. "They're calling it redeployment, but I've been listening to the unencrypted surface traffic. The trucks are going out full and coming back empty." "That sounds like evacuation, except nobody on Sublevel 1 has been told to pack. And the people going to the surface are all coming from Sublevel 2. He looked up at me. "Ryan, the people being pulled from Sub 1 to Sub 2, I don't think they're being sent to the surface. I think they're being sent down." The cold in my stomach had become permanent. It lived there now, a low, constant hum like standing too close to a transformer. "Down where?" 3, 4, I can't confirm, but the numbers don't add up. More people are going into E1 than are coming out at the surface. The difference has to be going somewhere. I leaned against the opposite wall and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent tube above us had a faint flicker. Maintenance would normally fix that within a day. Nobody was fixing anything. "Have you heard anything about what's actually happening on 4? I asked. Fierro shook his head. "Only that the response team requested additional biocontainment suits 2 days ago and was denied because the suits were already allocated." "Allocated to whom?" "That's what I asked. The answer I got was ongoing operations, which means nothing." On the third day, I saw Philip Odera. He was standing at the far end of the Sublevel 1 corridor near the water treatment access hatch. I almost didn't recognize him because of what he was wearing. A full biocontainment suit, the hood pushed back, the faceplate hanging open.
His face was gray. Not pale, gray. Like the color had been extracted rather than drained. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was holding his left arm against his chest in a way that suggested pain. "Philip," I said. He flinched. Then he saw me, and something in his expression collapsed. Relief or despair, I couldn't tell which. "Ryan, thank God." His voice was hoarse. "I need to get to the comms center. They won't let me through the checkpoint." "What happened to your arm?" "It doesn't matter. The comms center. Can you get me to the comms center?" "Philip, the comms center is locked down to command level access. I don't have—" "Then find someone who does. Find Fierro, find Palafox, find anyone." He stepped closer, and under the corridor lights, I could see that the gray in his face was not uniform. There were darker patches along his jawline and neck, like bruises, but they had a faintly iridescent quality, greenish-purple in certain angles, almost metallic. "What happened on 4? I said. He closed his eyes, opened them.
When he spoke, his voice was quieter, but each word had the weight of something rehearsed, something he had been carrying up through however many corridors and staircases it had taken him to reach Sublevel 1. The sample in NTF 7734 was not what the manifest described. There was additional organic material in the pod, a secondary biological structure attached to the primary sample. When Dr. Hassani's team opened the pod in the containment suite, the secondary structure was active. Active how? It was producing a vapor, a fine aerosol. By the time the team sealed the hood, 3 researchers had been exposed. Dr. Hassani was one of them. Exposed to what? We don't have a name for it. The aerosol contained a microorganism, or something analogous to a microorganism, that we have never catalogued. It is not terrestrial. Ryan, do you understand what I'm saying? The recovered materials in Dr. Hassani's lab came from the Kingman recovery. 1953. They have been in cold storage for over 70 years. The secondary structure was dormant for all that time. When the pod was opened in a warm, oxygenated environment, it activated. The Kingman recovery. I had heard the name exactly once, in a context I wasn't supposed to have overheard. A logistics briefing where Greg Palafox was discussing long-term storage protocols with a Sublevel 3 archivist. The archivist had used the phrase Kingman materials, and Palafox had changed the subject immediately when he noticed I was in the room. Philip, what happened to the 3 researchers? He was quiet for a moment. The discoloration on his neck shifted slightly, the iridescence catching the light as he swallowed. They changed, he said. Over about 6 hours. Fever first, then confusion, then a period of apparent recovery where they seemed normal, and then they stopped being themselves. The autonomic functions continued, heart rate, breathing, movement, but the cognitive architecture was gone. What replaced it was, he paused, aggressive, non-verbal, driven by proximity to other people. They attacked the rest of the team. Philip. Dr. Hassani bit 2 members of the response team before they could sedate her. The sedation held for about 90 minutes. When she woke up, the restraints didn't hold either. She was stronger, significantly stronger. The response team lost 4 people before they managed to seal the corridor. I felt the wall against my back. I hadn't been aware of leaning into it. The containment on 4 has failed, Philip said. There are at least 20 infected individuals on that sublevel. The security team sealed the elevator shafts and the stairwell access points, but the infected have been moving through maintenance conduits that aren't on the standard facility maps. They've reached Sublevel 3. 3. As of 6 hours ago. The command team knows. That's why they've been pulling people to 2. They're building a secondary containment line. But Ryan, the conduits connect all 4 sublevels. The infected will reach 2. It's a matter of time, not prevention. My mouth opened and nothing came out. Philip watched me with those bloodshot eyes, and the gray patches on his skin seemed to shift again, though that might have been the flickering fluorescent tube above us. Your arm, I said. Philip, your arm. He looked down at where his left arm was cradled against his chest. Slowly, he unzipped the top of the biocontainment suit and pulled the fabric away from his forearm. The skin from wrist to elbow was mottled with the same greenish-purple discoloration, denser and darker than what was on his face. At the center of his forearm, a wound, a bite, clearly a bite, had already begun to close itself, the edges knitting together with a speed that human tissue should not have been capable of. This happened 14 hours ago, he said. I have been lucid the entire time. The fever came and went. The The discoloration is spreading, but my cognition is intact. Dr. Hassani's team deteriorated within 6 hours. I am at 14, and I can still think. I don't know why. A different exposure level, a different immune response, my blood type. I have no idea. You need to be in containment. I need to be in the comm center. Because Colonel Lusk is preparing to seal Sublevel 1 and request an external military response. But she doesn't know what she's requesting a response to. She thinks this is a pathogen. A terrestrial pathogen that can be managed with standard biocontainment. Ryan, this is not terrestrial. The organisms in that aerosol are rewriting the host's neural architecture. It's not killing people and reanimating them. It's replacing what they are with something else. And the replacement is adapted. It learns. The infected on 4 have been observed coordinating. Coordinating? Working together. Testing doors. Avoiding the sections where the security team is strongest. Moving toward the sections where the conduit access is weakest. This is not a disease. This is a colonization mechanism. And if Lusk calls in a standard military biocontainment team, they will open this facility, and what is inside it will leave. I stood in that corridor with Philip O'Dara for 17 minutes. During that time, he told me things I am going to summarize because the details, in their full clinical specificity, would take longer than matters. The recovered materials from the Kingman site, a 1953 incident in Arizona that I later learned involved the retrieval of a crashed, non-terrestrial vehicle, had been in Groom Lake's long-term storage since the Eisenhower administration. Dozens of samples from the crash had been studied intermittently over the decades, yielding data that was classified at levels far above my understanding. The biological samples, tissue, fluid, and what appeared to be a form of dense organic lattice, had been largely inert. They didn't decay. They didn't respond to standard cultures. They sat in cold storage and did nothing, and eventually the prevailing assumption among the research staff was that they were dead. The secondary structure in NTF 7734 was not dead. It was dormant. The warm, oxygenated, humid environment of Dr. Hassani's containment suite was, apparently, close enough to whatever conditions the organism required. The aerosol it produced was not a weapon in any intentional sense. Philip's best understanding, and he was a microbiologist, not a xenobiologist, so his understanding was limited, was that the organism's reproductive cycle involved exactly this mechanism. Release a vapor, colonize a host, repurpose the host's motor and sensory systems for the organism's own use. The host's higher cognitive functions were not destroyed, but overwritten. What remained was something that looked human, moved like a human, and possessed a human body's capabilities, but was directed by an entirely different intelligence. Or not intelligence. Philip wasn't certain. Maybe instinct, maybe programming. The distinction didn't matter at the practical level. What mattered was that the infected were spreading through the facility. They were getting smarter, or at least more organized, as their numbers grew. And the command team's response was based on a misunderstanding of what they were dealing with. "You need to tell Lusk," I said. "Lusk won't see me." I went to the command office on Sub 1. Her aide took one look at my face and called security. I spent 2 hours in a holding room before I convinced the guard to let me walk. They don't want me near anyone. You should probably not be near anyone. In 14 hours, I will either turn or I won't. But right now, every minute I spend being quarantined is a minute Lusk spends planning a response that will get everyone killed. Not just here, out there. I understood what he was asking. He wanted me to be his voice, to carry his information to someone with command authority, because the information was worth more than the risk of it coming from a potentially compromised source. But he was also asking me to trust him, to trust that his 14 hours of lucidity were real and not a slower version of the same process that had taken Dr. Hassani in 6. To trust that the discoloration spreading across his skin was a symptom of resistance rather than a symptom of a longer incubation.
To trust a man I had worked alongside for 4 years but never truly known, in a corridor that smelled like recycled air and antiseptic, while the facility around us was quietly eating itself from the bottom up. "The comms center," I said. "If we can get a message out before Lusk shuts everything down, who would we even contact?" "Edwards, Stratcom. Anyone with authority to modify the response profile. The message doesn't need to be long. It needs to say one thing. Do not enter this facility. Do not breach containment. Incinerate it if necessary, but do not open it." "Philip, we're inside it." He looked at me. The gray in his face was darker than it had been 17 minutes ago. Or maybe that was the light. Or maybe I was watching too closely. "Yes," he said. "We are." Getting to the comms center required passing through the Sublevel 1 security checkpoint, which was staffed by 2 armed security police and a biometric scanner. Under normal conditions, my badge gave me access to the logistics corridor, the cafeteria, the quarters wing, and the briefing room. The comms center was in the restricted operations section, accessible only to communications personnel, command staff, and specifically authorized visitors. Tomas Fierro was specifically authorized. His security police credentials gave him access to every section of Sublevel 1. When I found him in the corridor and explained, briefly, without clinical detail, that Philip O'Dara had information from Sublevel 4 that needed to be transmitted externally, Fierro asked one question. "Is he compromised?" "He was bitten 14 hours ago. He's still lucid. He thinks he's resistant." "Does he think that? Or does he know it?" "He doesn't know. Nobody knows. The organism is new." Fierro looked at me for a long time. He was a compact man, mid-30s, with a face that processed information before it showed emotion. Whatever calculation he ran behind that face took about 8 seconds. "Leave him in the corridor outside the comms center. I'll get you inside. You relay what he tells you. He doesn't enter the room." "Okay. And Ryan, if he changes while we're doing this, I need you to tell me immediately. Not after you've assessed the situation. Not after you've tried to help him. Immediately." "Understood." Philip accepted the arrangement without argument. The walk to the comm center took 4 minutes. The corridors were nearly empty. Sublevel 1's population had been thinned by the quiet relocations of the past 3 days, and the people who remained were mostly behind closed doors, following the shelter-in-place guidance that nobody had officially issued, but everyone had intuited. Fierro badged us through the checkpoint. The 2 security police on duty recognized him and waved us past with only a brief look at me. Philip stayed in the corridor, leaning against the wall with his biocontainment suit zipped back up to his chin. The overhead lights caught the iridescence on his neck one more time before the door closed between us. The comm center was smaller than I expected. 4 workstations, a bank of encrypted radio equipment, 2 satellite uplink terminals, and a wall of monitors showing camera feeds from the surface. One operator was on duty, a young woman in Air Force uniform whose name tape read Fan. She looked up when we entered, and her hand moved toward her sidearm before Fierro raised his badge. "Staff Sergeant Fierro, Security Police. We need to send an external message on the emergency channel." "External comms are suspended by order of Colonel Lusk," Airman Fan said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes moved between us with the careful attention of someone who had been alone in a room for too long. "I understand the suspension. This is a security override. The information is time-sensitive and directly relevant to the containment status on sublevels 3 and 4.
Sergeant, I can't authorize. I'm not asking you to authorize. I'm asking you to operate the equipment. The authorization is mine. Log it under my credentials. Fan stared at him. Then she turned to her console and began entering commands. While she worked, Fierro opened the door a crack, and I relayed Philip's core message through the gap. Philip spoke in short, clear statements. I repeated them to Fierro, who wrote them by hand on a message form from the console. The message, stripped to its essence, said, "The Groom Lake facility is experiencing a non-terrestrial biological containment failure. The pathogen rewrites human neurology and produces coordinated, aggressive hosts. Standard biocontainment breach protocols will result in release. The facility should be sealed externally and monitored. Do not enter. Do not attempt personnel extraction." Fan transmitted it on the emergency satellite channel at 0217. The acknowledgement came back 11 minutes later, a terse, automated receipt confirmation from the Stratcom relay. Whether anyone actually read it, processed it, or acted on it, we had no way of knowing. While we waited for the confirmation, I watched the surface camera feeds on the wall monitors. The Nevada desert at night was a dark expanse punctuated by runway lights and the distant glow of security posts along the perimeter. Everything looked normal, empty, still. Then, on the feed from Camera 7, the one covering the north vehicle gate, I saw a figure walking across the tarmac. It moved with a steady, purposeful gait, not running, not stumbling. It was wearing a white lab coat. It walked directly toward the gate, reached it, and stood there, facing outward, motionless. "Fan," I said. "Camera 7. She looked. Fierro looked. We all watched the figure on the screen. It stood at the gate for about 30 seconds. Then 3 more figures appeared from the same direction, walking with the same steady gait. They joined the first one at the gate. All 4 faced outward. All 4 stood still. "Those are sublevel personnel," Fawn said quietly. "They're on the surface." "How are they on the surface?" Fierro picked up his radio, tried 3 frequencies. Static on all of them. He put the radio down and looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, his face showed something it hadn't processed first. "The secondary containment line on 2, he said. "It's already failed." The next 6 hours compressed and expanded in ways that my memory has never been able to organize into clean sequence. Some moments lasted minutes. Some minutes vanished entirely. What I can reconstruct. Fierro, Fawn, and I sealed the comm center from inside. The door was a standard interior security door. Magnetic lock, steel core, designed to resist unauthorized entry, but not sustained physical assault. We pushed 2 equipment racks against it as a brace. Through the gap in the door, I told Philip what was happening. He nodded. His face was darker still. "I'll stay here," he said. "If I change, you'll hear it. The door will hold long enough." "Philip, Ryan, go. Do whatever you can from inside that room. I'll watch the corridor." So Philip O'Dara sat down on the floor outside the comms center, a bitten man with an alien organism rewriting his biochemistry. And he kept watch. I closed the door, and I did not open it again. Inside the comm center, we monitored the surface cameras. Over the next 2 hours, more figures appeared from the facility's access points. Personnel exits, vehicle bays, ventilation shafts. They moved onto the surface in small groups, always with that same purposeful, unhurried gait. By the 3rd hour, I counted 47 of them visible across the camera feeds. They congregated near the perimeter fences, facing outward. Not trying to breach the fence, not moving erratically. Standing. Waiting. "What are they waiting for?" Fan said. I didn't answer because I didn't know, but the word that kept surfacing in my mind was one Philip had used: colonization. A colonization mechanism doesn't panic. It doesn't rampage. It establishes, consolidates, and expands. The infected were on the surface now. They had moved through 4 sublevels of a hardened military facility, breached every containment line, and reached open air. The next logical step was not to scatter into the desert. It was to wait for whatever came to them. And something would come. We had sent our message. Stratcom had received it. Somewhere, a response was being organized. Trucks, helicopters, containment teams.
People coming toward the facility, toward the gate, toward the figures standing patiently in the dark. "We need to send another message," I said. "A correction, or a warning." The first one said, "Don't enter." It needs to say, "Don't approach." The perimeter is compromised. Fierro was already at the console. Fan transmitted the second message at 4:45. No acknowledgement came back. She tried again at 5:10. Again at 5:30. The satellite channel returned static. "The uplink might be down," she said. "Or they've cut us off on the receiving end." Why would they cut us off? Because the first message told them not to enter, and the second message told them the infected are already outside. If I were Stratcom, and I got those 2 messages from the same facility, I'd assume the facility was lost and stop treating communications from it as reliable. She was right. We had talked ourselves into silence. The system that was supposed to carry our warning had been fed 2 messages that, together, made everything we said sound like it was coming from inside the disaster, rather than ahead of it. Fierro stood at the camera monitors, watching. The sun was coming up outside. The desert light turned the figures at the perimeter fence into silhouettes, then into detailed shapes as the shadows shortened. I could see faces now, people I recognized. Keenan Birch, the transport driver with the coffee thermos. Janet Murayama. Greg Palafox. Greg was standing at the north gate, facing south, facing back toward the facility. His glasses were missing. His mouth was open slightly, and even through the grainy camera feed I could see the discoloration along his throat. "Those are our people," Fan whispered. "They were our people," Fierro said. Nothing in his voice moved when he said it, but his hand on the console was gripping the edge hard enough to blanch his knuckles. At 0700, I heard a sound from the corridor outside the comm center. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Not urgent, patient. I went to the door and pressed my ear against it. "Philip?" The tapping stopped. Then his voice, lower than before, rougher, but still his. "Still me, Ryan. 18 hours now. The discoloration has reached my hands. My left eye is blurring, but it's still me. How do you feel?" A pause. Like 2 radio stations playing at the same time. I can hear both, but I'm still choosing which one to listen to. "Philip, we lost the satellite uplink. We can't reach anyone outside." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had the careful cadence of someone choosing each word from a shrinking vocabulary. "There is a hard line. A buried landline that connects Groom Lake to Creech Air Force Base. It was installed in the 1960s as a backup for exactly this kind of communications failure. The terminal is in Sublevel 1, Section D, the old maintenance supervisor's office, room D17. It may still be functional." "How do you know about it?" "Dr. Hassani mentioned it once. She had been here longer than anyone. She knew things about this facility that aren't in any manual." I looked at Fierro. He had heard every word. "D17 is on the other side of Sublevel 1, he said.
past the quarters wing, past the cafeteria. If the infected have reached Sub-1 from below, that entire section may be compromised. Maybe, I said.
Ryan. If that hardline works, it's the only way to reach anyone before a response team drives into 47 infected at the gate. Fierro looked at the camera feeds. The figures at the perimeter hadn't moved. The sun was fully up now, the desert bright and flat and merciless. Somewhere beyond the camera range, on a highway or in a helicopter or in a convoy, people were probably already heading toward us. "I'll go with you," he said. "You're the only one here who can operate a weapon. Fan can seal the comm center behind us. If we don't come back, she stays put and waits for external contact. And if there is no external contact, then she waits longer." Fan said nothing during this exchange. She sat at her console with her hands flat on the desk, her face showing the particular stillness of someone who has accepted a set of facts without yet deciding what to feel about them. "Go," she said. "I'll be here." Fierro and I left the comm center at 7:20. Philip was sitting against the wall where I'd last seen him, his biocontainment suit stained with something that had seeped through the fabric at his left shoulder. The discoloration on his face was dense enough now that in the corridor's fluorescent light, his skin looked like it belonged to a different species. "The hardline," Philip said. "D17. We're going now. Ryan." He reached up with his right hand. The left had stopped moving sometime in the last hour, curled against his chest like a bird's folded wing. His right hand caught my wrist, and the grip was stronger than it should have been. Not aggressive, desperate. "If I'm not here when you come back, don't look for me. If I'm here and I'm not talking, don't open the door. Philip, say you understand." "I understand." He let go. His fingers left faint marks on my wrist that I could still see 2 days later. 4 small crescents where his nails, harder than fingernails should have been, almost chitinous, had pressed into the skin. The corridors of Sublevel 1 were empty in a way that went beyond abandoned. The fluorescent lights were still on. The air system was still running. Doors were closed but not sealed. It felt like walking through a building that had been evacuated an hour ago by people who expected to come back but never did. Fierro moved ahead with his sidearm drawn, clearing each intersection before waving me forward. The quarters wing was silent. Every door closed. We passed Darnell's room, my room, and I didn't stop. But I looked at the door and thought about his bunk and his tablet and the last thing he'd said to me. Probably just need extra hands for something. The cafeteria was worse. Not because anything violent had happened there. There was no blood, no damage, no overturned furniture, but the serving line was still set up for a meal that had never been served. Trays of food sat under heat lamps that had long since cooled. The industrial coffee maker still had half a pot in it. And on the floor, near the far wall, a single shoe. A woman's sneaker, white with a blue stripe, just lying there on its side as though someone had stepped out of it mid-stride. We didn't stop. Fierro's breathing was steady, controlled, the breathing of someone trained to manage their own physiology under stress. Mine was not. By the time we reached Section D, my hands were shaking and my shirt was dark with sweat. Room D17 was a small office at the end of a dead-end corridor. The door was unlocked. Inside, a metal desk, a filing cabinet, a chair with cracked vinyl upholstery, and on the wall behind the desk, a beige telephone handset mounted in a steel housing with the words, "Direct Line." Creech AFB stenciled above it. Fierro covered the corridor while I lifted the handset. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then a dial tone.
ancient, analog, beautiful. I could have wept at the sound of it. The call connected on the second ring. A voice answered with a call sign I didn't recognize. I identified myself by name and facility. There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end said, "Hold for duty, officer." 40 seconds of silence. Then a different voice, older, clipped, tired. "This is Colonel Mercer, Creech Operations. Identify and authenticate." I gave him my employee ID, my section code, and the date-specific authentication phrase that all Groom Lake personnel were required to memorize weekly. He confirmed it. "Lee, we have your facility flagged as compromised. Stratcom received 2 messages from your comms center 6 hours ago. A response element is being assembled at Nellis. ETA to your perimeter is approximately 3 hours. Colonel, the response element cannot approach the perimeter. The infected have reached the surface. There are at least 47 of them congregated at the fence line. They're organized. They're waiting." Silence. "Say again?" I said it again. I gave him the details Philip had given me. Non-terrestrial pathogen, neural rewrite, coordinated behavior, colonization pattern. I spoke for 4 straight minutes without stopping. Fierro stood at the door with his weapon up, watching the corridor, and the only sound besides my voice was the hum of the air system and, distantly, somewhere deeper in the building, something that might have been footsteps. Colonel Mercer listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for almost 10 seconds. "Lee, what you're describing is not consistent with any known biological threat model." "I know. You're asking me to halt a military response element based on information from a single compromised facility with no external verification." "Colonel, if that element breaches the perimeter, the infected will scatter into the desert. You will have a dispersal event in open terrain with no way to track or contain it. You lose the bottleneck. Right now, they're contained by their own choice. They're at the fence. They're stationary. They're waiting for exactly the kind of approach you're planning. You cannot give them what they're waiting for." More silence. Then, "Hold this line. Do not disconnect." He put me on hold. The line hummed. Fierro glanced back at me from the doorway. "He's going up the chain," I said. "How far up?" "As far as it takes for someone to either believe us or not." We waited. The hold lasted 9 minutes. During that time, the footsteps I had heard earlier grew louder, then softer, then stopped. Fierro's weapon tracked the sound, his body angled so he could cover both directions of the corridor. Mercer came back on. "Lee, the response element has been redirected to a staging area south of the facility perimeter. They will hold at a 5-mile standoff pending further assessment. A drone overflight is being tasked for visual confirmation of what you've described. You are to remain on this line and provide real-time reporting. Do you copy?" "I copy." "And Lee, the individual who provided your information, the bitten researcher, where is he now?" I thought about Philip sitting in the corridor outside the comm center, 18 hours into a process that had taken others 6. Philip with his graying skin and his hardening fingernails and his voice that sounded like 2 radio stations playing at once. "He's on Sublevel 1. He's been lucid for over 18 hours post-exposure. I don't know how much longer that will hold. If he turns, you need to be somewhere he can't reach." "I know. Stay on the line." Fierro and I stayed in D-17 for the next 5 hours. The hardline telephone became our only tether to the outside world, and through it, I fed information to Colonel Mercer's team as it was requested. Camera feeds were inaccessible from this room, so my reporting was limited to what I could hear through the walls and what Fierro could observe from the corridor doorway. What we heard, over those 5 hours, was the facility coming apart. Not explosively, not dramatically, but incrementally, the sounds of a functioning building, the steady hum of the air system, the click of magnetic locks cycling, the distant whir of elevator motors, dropped away. The air system failed at 0940, and within an hour the corridors began to warm. The magnetic locks on the Section D doors released when the power to their circuit failed at 10:15, and every door in our corridor swung open simultaneously with a sound like a sigh. The elevator motors had already been silent for days, and underneath the subtraction of mechanical sound, a new sound emerged. Footsteps. Not the scattered, individual footsteps of people walking to meals or meetings. A collective movement. Many feet, moving in the same direction, at the same pace. It rose and fell like a tide, swelling toward our section and then receding, as though whatever was moving through the building was searching systematically rather than wandering. At 11:30, the footsteps came to the end of our corridor and stopped. Fierro raised his weapon. I held the phone against my chest so Mercer's team wouldn't hear my breathing. The fluorescent lights in the corridor had been dimming for an hour as the power fluctuated, and in the half-light, the far end of the hallway was a gray rectangle framing nothing. Then a figure appeared. It stood at the corridor entrance, motionless. The light was too dim for me to identify it. It was wearing civilian clothes, a polo shirt and khakis, standard off-duty attire for facility staff. Its head was tilted at a slight angle, the way a dog tilts its head when it hears a new sound. Fierro held position. His breathing was inaudible. The figure stood for perhaps 30 seconds, its head slowly panning from one side of the corridor to the other. Then it turned and walked away, its footsteps joining the larger collective sound that was already receding deeper into the building. Neither of us moved for a long time after that. "It was mapping," Fierro said quietly. "Checking which corridors are occupied." "Do you think it saw us?" "It didn't need to see us. It was listening." At 12:45, Mercer came back on the line with an update. The drone overflight had confirmed my report. The aerial footage showed more than 60 individuals standing in organized clusters along the facility's perimeter fence, motionless, facing outward. The footage had been forwarded to Northcom, and a classified briefing was in progress. The response element remained at 5-mile standoff. "Lee, what's your current status?" "Sublevel 1, room D17. Power is failing. Air system is down. We've had visual contact with one infected individual in our corridor. It did not engage." "Can you reach the surface?" I looked at Fierro. He shook his head once. "Negative. The route to the surface would take us through sections we know are compromised, and the infected are already on the surface at the perimeter. Reaching open ground doesn't improve our position." "Understood. Lee, I'm going to be straight with you. The discussion at Northcom is trending toward a denial of area response. Do you understand what that means?" I understood. A denial of area response meant making the facility, and everything in it, uninhabitable. It meant fuel-air explosives, thermobaric ordnance, or in extreme cases, something worse. It meant that the people making decisions 50 miles away were beginning to conclude that the facility was lost and that the only responsible action was to ensure nothing left it. "Colonel, there are still living personnel inside this facility." Airman Fan is in the comms center on Sub 1. A civilian researcher named Philip O'Dara may still be lucid in the same area. I don't know who else, but people are alive in here. I'm aware. That's why the decision hasn't been made yet. But Lee, the infected on the surface are already outside the building. If they move beyond the perimeter fence, the calculus changes. We're watching them. As long as they stay put, we have time. If they disperse,
we don't. Stay put. The phrase landed on me with a weight that felt physical. The infected were staying put because they were waiting. If the military held off, the infected would eventually realize that nothing was coming, and then they would move. Outward, into the desert, toward highways and towns and the fragile, unaware world beyond the restricted zone. And if the military didn't hold off, if they came in, the approach itself would trigger exactly the dispersal they feared. It was a trap.
Not a designed trap, not a deliberate stratagem, but a functional one. The colonization mechanism had placed its hosts in a position where every response available to the people outside was wrong. "How much time do we have?" I asked. "I don't know. Maybe 12 hours? Maybe less. The decision will depend on whether the infected move first." "Colonel, we're going to try to reach the surface through a non-standard route. There are maintenance shafts on the east side of Sub-1 that connect to the vehicle bay on the surface. They're narrow and they're not on the maps, but they exist." "How do you know about them?" I almost laughed. "I'm a logistics coordinator. My job is knowing how things move through this building." Fierro and I left D-17 at 1300 after I gave Mercer the maintenance shaft location and our intended route so that if we reached the surface, the response element would know we were friendly. The hardline handset hung in its steel housing, the connection still live, the line humming quietly in the empty room behind us. The maintenance shafts were a network of narrow conduits used for cable routing and air handling. They were never intended for human transit, but at various points in the facility's history, maintenance crews had widened certain sections to allow access for repairs. I knew about 3 such sections on Sublevel 1 because I had processed the materials transfer requests for the widening work 2 years ago. One of them, Shaft E12, ran vertically from Sublevel 1 to the surface vehicle bay, a climb of roughly 60 feet with hand and foot rungs welded to the inside of the shaft. Getting to E12 meant crossing back through the quarters wing and past the cafeteria. The same ground we'd already covered. But the building was different now. The lights were barely functional, scattered tubes still glowing at maybe a third of their normal output, casting everything in a jaundiced twilight. The air was warm and stale, the recycled chemical taste of it growing sharper as the filtration system deteriorated. The quarters wing was no longer empty. Doors that had been closed were now open. Inside the rooms, our rooms, the places where we had slept and read and waited, shapes moved. Not fast, not aggressively. Slowly, methodically, touching walls, opening drawers, picking up objects and examining them with the focused, deliberate attention of someone cataloging a museum exhibit. Through one doorway, I saw a figure sitting on a bunk, holding a tablet in both hands, turning it over and over as though trying to understand its purpose. Fierro moved, and I followed. We did not run. Running makes noise, and noise draws attention. We walked at a measured pace, close to the wall, breathing through our noses, placing each foot with deliberate control. The figures in the rooms did not look up. They were absorbed in their examination of the space, and something about their focus suggested that they had already mapped the corridors and dismissed them. They were interested in the objects now, the residue of human life. We reached the cafeteria without incident. The food on the serving line had begun to smell. The shoe was still on the floor. We passed through and into the Section C access corridor, where the maintenance shaft entrances were located behind bolted service panels. The panel for E12 was already open. Fierro stopped, raised his weapon. The panel had been removed and set carefully against the wall beside the opening. Inside the shaft, the darkness was total. "Someone's already been through here," I whispered. "Or something." We stood at the opening for a full minute,
listening. The shaft was silent. No breathing, no movement, no sound of any kind. "I'll go first," Fierro said. "Count to 30 after I start climbing. If you hear anything wrong, go back to D17 and get on the hard line." He holstered his sidearm, stepped into the shaft, and began climbing. The rungs made a faint metallic sound under his weight, a rhythmic pinging that faded as he ascended. I counted to 30. Then I followed.
The climb was 60 feet of darkness and iron. My hands found each rung by feel, the metal cool and slightly greasy from decades of condensation. Above me, Fierro's boots scraped softly. Below me, the shaft opening was a pale rectangle that shrank as I climbed until it was a postage stamp of dim light and then nothing. At the top, Fierro's hand found my shoulder and pulled me up through a hatch into blinding daylight. The vehicle bay. Concrete floor, high ceiling, corrugated steel walls. 3 military vehicles, 2 Humvees and a flatbed truck, parked in a row. The bay doors were open, and through them the Nevada desert poured in. Heat, light, dry wind, the vast flat nothing of Groom Lake stretching to the mountains. We were on the surface. Fierro scanned the bay. Empty. He moved to the nearest Humvee, checked the cab. Keys in the ignition, standard protocol for emergency vehicles in a secure facility. He turned back to me and nodded. "We drive south, 5 miles to the staging area. Stay below the ridgeline so we're not visible from the perimeter fence."
Fierro, Philip, Fan. His jaw tightened. "Ryan, we can barely help ourselves right now. Fan is sealed in the comm center. She's alive. Philip might still be. Philip is 18 hours into an alien infection, and the comm center is on the other side of a building full of compromised personnel. We go south. We reach the staging area. We give them everything we know. And then maybe we can organize a targeted extraction." He was right. The logic was clear. The route back to the comm center was through corridors that were no longer empty, past rooms full of figures who were growing more attentive with each hour. Going back was choosing certain risk over possible benefit, and the possible benefit depended on Philip still being Philip and Fan still being behind a sealed door that might not hold much longer. But I thought about Philip's hand on my wrist.
The 4 crescents his nails had left. The way he'd said, "Still me, Ryan." And I thought about Airman Fan, alone in a small room with equipment she couldn't use, waiting for someone to come back through a door she'd been told to keep sealed. "Give me 20 minutes, I said. "Ryan, 20 minutes. If I'm not back, you drive." Fierro looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between anger and respect, sharpened by the understanding that he could not physically prevent me from going without creating the kind of noise that would bring everything in the building toward us. 15, he said. "I start the engine at minute 12. I went back into the shaft. The descent was faster than the climb. My arms burned, and my hands slipped twice on the greasy rungs, catching myself with a jolt that sent sound ringing up and down the metal column. At the bottom, I stepped into the corridor and moved. The quarters wing was different now. The figures had left the rooms and were in the hallway. 7 of them, walking in a loose column toward the Section B junction. Their gait was synchronized, left, right, with a uniformity that no group of humans would produce naturally. They moved as one organism distributed across 7 bodies, and the sound of their footsteps was the collective tide I had heard from D17. I pressed myself against the wall and waited for them to pass. They did not look at me. Their attention was forward, directed at something ahead of them in the facility's deeper sections. I watched them go, and then I ran. Running made noise.
I heard my own feet on the concrete, and the rasp of my breathing, and the frantic, irregular rhythm of a body moving at panic speed. The comm center corridor was ahead. I rounded the last corner and saw the door. Closed, the equipment racks still braced against it from inside. And Philip. He was sitting where I'd left him, his back against the wall. His biocontainment suit was split along the left seam, and the skin beneath was uniformly gray-green, the iridescence so dense it looked like metal. His left arm hung at his side, the fingers extended and rigid, each nail lengthened into a dark, curved point. His eyes were open and focused on me. "Philip?" His mouth moved. The sound that came out was not words, not at first. It was a frequency, a low, oscillating tone that seemed to originate from his chest rather than his throat. Then, layered beneath it, like a voice coming through a closing door. "Still me. Can you move?" "Ryan." The voice was nearly gone. "Don't take me out. Leave me." "Philip, I'm not—" "If I go outside, they'll use me. I can feel them. The others. They're—" He closed his eyes. The oscillating tone rose in pitch. "They're calling. Constantly. I can hold against it in here. Small space. Walls help. Outside, too many signals. I'll lose the frequency." "The frequency?" His eyes opened. For a moment, a brief, clear, terminal moment, Philip Odero was entirely himself. His gaze was sharp and present and full of a knowledge that was simultaneously human and something vastly, terrifyingly beyond human. "My frequency. The one that's me. It's getting quieter, Ryan, but it's still playing. As long as I'm in a small space with walls, I can hear it. Don't take me into the open." I knelt beside him. His right hand found my wrist again, and this time the grip was gentle. "Get Fan out," he said. "The shaft you came through. Take her and go." "Philip, there has to be something. There is something. Later. Not now. Now you go." His hand released me. The oscillating tone deepened. His eyes began to drift, tracking something I couldn't see, and I watched the last clear light in them flicker like a bulb on a failing circuit. I stood up and banged on the comm center door. "Fan, it's Lee. Open the door." Shuffling inside. The scrape of equipment racks being pulled back. The magnetic lock disengaged, and Airman Fan's face appeared in the gap, pale and dry-lipped and wide-eyed. "We have a route to the surface. Maintenance shaft E12. We need to go now." She looked past me at Philip. Something crossed her face. Pity, fear, revulsion. All of it compressed into a single flinch that she mastered immediately. "He's staying?" "He's staying." She grabbed her sidearm, stepped over the threshold, and we ran. Past Philip, who did not look up. Past the quarters wing, where the figures had returned to their rooms and resumed their patient cataloging. Through the cafeteria, through Section C, to the shaft. Fan climbed first. I followed. My arms nearly failed me halfway up, the muscles shaking so badly that each rung felt like it might be the last one I could grip. Daylight hit me at the top like a physical force. Fierro was in the Humvee, engine running. He saw Fan, and his eyes flicked behind her, looking for Philip, and I shook my head once. We drove. The 5 miles to the staging area took 12 minutes on a dirt service road that paralleled the dry lake bed. Fierro drove without headlights. The sun was high enough that we didn't need them, and any light source would be visible for miles across the flat terrain. In the rear-view mirror, the facility shrank to a cluster of low buildings and antenna masts, unremarkable, banal. The most consequential place on Earth looking exactly like nothing. The staging area was a semicircle of military vehicles, armored transports, communication trucks, 2 Bradley fighting vehicles, arranged on a hardpan turnout south of Highway 375. Soldiers in mop gear watched our approach through rifle scopes. Fierro stopped the Humvee 300 yards out, and we walked the rest of the way with our hands visible. Colonel Mercer was not there.
His authority was being relayed through a Major Catalina Obregon, a stocky woman with a voice that belonged in a much larger body. She pulled the 3 of us into a command vehicle and debriefed us for 90 minutes. I told her everything. Fierro filled in the tactical gaps. Fan provided the communications timeline. When I finished, Obregon sat quietly for a moment, her hands flat on the folding table between us. "The infected on the perimeter," she said. "You're telling me they're not wandering. They're positioned. Positioned and waiting. Their behavior suggests they're responding to a coordinated drive, something directing them toward the boundary of the facility's footprint." Directed by what? The organism. The original biological material from the Kingman recovery. Philip believed, Dr. Odera believed, that the organism operates as a distributed system. Each infected individual is a node. The more nodes, the more complex the coordination. What we're seeing at the fence is not instinct. It's strategy.
A strategy for what?
Expansion. Contact with new hosts. The fence is the last barrier. Once they cross it, or once someone comes close enough to the other side, the expansion accelerates.
Obregon looked at Fierro. "Staff Sergeant, your assessment?" "Ma'am, I watched them move through the facility over the course of 12 hours. Early on, they wandered. By the time we left, they were operating in formation. Whatever's driving them is learning. Fast." She exhaled through her nose. "Northcom is 2 hours from a decision point. The options on the table are kinetic denial, leveling the facility and the surrounding area, or a phased containment using the geographic isolation. No one is talking about engagement. The footage from the drones has convinced the senior leadership that direct contact is off the table." "What about the people still inside?" I said.
Lee, how many living, uninfected personnel do you believe are still in that facility? Philip, maybe, depending on what living meant for him now, and whether the walls of that corridor were enough to keep his frequency playing. At least one, I said. Possibly more. I can't confirm numbers. One possible survivor in a facility with an estimated 60-plus hostile entities and an unknown biological contaminant of confirmed non-terrestrial origin. She let the sentence hang in the air between us. The math on a rescue operation is not favorable. I could have argued. I could have pushed back, invoked Philip's name, described his lucidity, explained that his resistance to the organism might represent something scientifically critical, a partial immunity, a clue to the organism's mechanism, a thread that could be pulled toward a response or a treatment. All of that was true, and all of it would have sounded, to Major Obregon, like a man trying to justify a personal attachment with strategic language. Instead, I said, "Major, the organism in that facility is adapted for colonization. It has been dormant for 70 years, and it activated in hours. If Northcom levels the site, they'll destroy the only contained population of infected hosts we have. Every piece of information about how this thing works, how it spreads, how it might be stopped, it's in there. In the hosts. In the facility's records. In the biology of a man who has been resisting conversion for over 20 hours. Destroying the site is permanent. Containment gives us time." Obregon studied me. Her face gave nothing away, but something in her posture shifted. A settling,
like a structure accepting a new load. "I'll forward your assessment," she said. The next 2 days were a purgatory of waiting. The staging area grew as additional military units arrived. Marine elements from 29 Palms, Air Force security forces from Nellis, a team of specialists from Fort Detrick, whose unit designation I was not told. The perimeter around Groom Lake expanded to a 10-mile radius. Drone surveillance ran continuously. The infected on the surface had grown to over 80, and their behavior had evolved. They now moved in organized patterns around the facility's perimeter, walking the fence line in slow, continuous loops, like sentries on a wall. Fierro, Fan, and I were housed in a field tent and debriefed repeatedly by different teams with different clearances. Each debriefing covered the same ground from a different angle, and I told the story of NTF 7734 so many times that it began to feel like something that had happened to someone else. The weight discrepancy, the initialed form, the container passing through my checkpoint and into the tunnel and down to Sublevel 4, where a dormant organism from a 1953 crash site in Arizona woke up in a warm room and began to reproduce the only way it knew how. On the second day, a drone equipped with thermal imaging confirmed the presence of 3 heat signatures inside the facility that were distinct from the infected population. The infected ran at a slightly elevated body temperature, 100.2 to 101.5 degrees Fahrenheit, while the 3 uninfected signatures registered at normal 98.6. 2 of the signatures were on Sublevel 1. The third was on the surface, in the vehicle bay. "The vehicle bay," I said, when Obregon showed me the thermal map. "That's near the shaft we climbed out of. Someone else found the same route but didn't make it out. Or chose not to leave." I thought about that for a long time. On the evening of the second day, Northcom issued its decision. The facility would be sealed externally, using concrete and steel barriers at all access points, covered by a permanent armed perimeter at the 10-mile radius. No kinetic strike, no entry. The site would be monitored indefinitely, while a research task force developed an approach to the organism based on the information Fierro, Fan, and I had provided. The decision meant that Philip O'Dara, if he was still Philip O'Dara, would remain inside, along with whoever the other 2 thermal signatures belonged to, sealed in by deliberate choice, because the alternative was worse. Obregon delivered the news to me in the command vehicle with the door closed. She did not soften it. "Lee, this is the outcome your own assessment supported. Containment over destruction. Time over finality. This is what you argued for." I argued for containment as an alternative to demolition, not as an alternative to rescue. There was never a rescue option on the table. You know that. I knew it. I had known it in the corridor outside the comm center when Philip told me not to take him out. He had understood, 20 hours into his transformation, what it took Northcom 2 days to decide. The facility was the container. Breaking it open, for any reason, in any direction, was the one thing that could not be allowed. And my initials were on the form that started it. 3 weeks after the sealing, I was transferred to a debriefing facility in Colorado. Fierro was sent to a different location. Fan, as far as I know, went to a third. They separated us deliberately, standard procedure for witnesses to a classified event, to prevent collaborative narrative construction. Each of our accounts would be compared independently. At the Colorado facility, I spent 6 weeks being interviewed by people who never gave me their real names. I described the weight discrepancy 147 times by my own count. I described Philip's symptoms, his lucidity, his theory about the colonization mechanism, his final words. I described the infected's behavior, the coordinated movement, the systematic searching, the patient positioning at the fence. I described everything I had seen and heard and understood. And then I described everything I had failed to do, beginning and ending with a 1.9 kilogram discrepancy on a Thursday morning. On the 39th day of debriefing, one of the interviewers, a woman who went by Dr. Ando, and who I suspected was not a doctor of anything, asked me a question that none of the others had. Mr. Lee, when you initialed the manifest for NTF 7734, were you aware that the secondary biological material in the pod was active? No. Were you aware that the pod contained any secondary material? No. The manifest listed only the primary sample. But you detected the weight discrepancy. Yes. And you chose not to flag it. Yes. Why? I had answered this question before, many times, with the same explanation. The 11 previous flags, the pattern of clerical errors, the social friction, the professional assumption that the discrepancy was trivial. All of that was true. But Dr. Ando was not asking for the explanation. She was asking for the reason beneath the explanation, the thing that lived under the professional logic like groundwater under concrete. Because it was easier, I said. Because flagging it would have required effort and patience, and the willingness to be wrong in front of people who would remember. And not flagging it required only a pen stroke, and the assumption that someone else had already caught whatever I was catching. I deferred to the system instead of doing my job within it. Dr. Ando wrote something in her notebook. She didn't look up when she asked the next question. If you had flagged it, do you believe the outcome would have been different?
The containment event might have been delayed. The organism would still have been there. Sooner or later, someone would have opened that pod in a warm room. But maybe the delay would have mattered. Maybe it would have given someone enough time to recognize what the secondary material was before it activated. I can't know. So your failure may have been consequential, or may have been irrelevant. Yes. And you carry it as though it was consequential. I carry it as though it might have been. That's enough. She closed her notebook. The debriefing ended an hour later, and I never saw Dr. Ando again. There is a version of this story that ends with me walking out of the Colorado facility and into the rest of my life, carrying the knowledge of what happened at Groom Lake as a private weight that only I can feel. That version is neat. It closes the arc. Confession, crisis, consequence, penance. But the facility is still there, sealed, monitored, alive in a way that the word alive was never designed to describe. The drones still fly their circuits. The thermal cameras still register heat signatures inside. Fewer now than in the first weeks, or possibly the same number in different configurations, as the organism continues whatever process the organism is engaged in. The fence is still standing. The figures no longer patrol it. They went back inside at some point during the first month, retreating into the building as though they had accepted the barrier and decided to work with what they had. That is the part that keeps me in the present tense when everything else has settled into the past. Whatever is happening inside Groom Lake is not finished. It is not a disaster that occurred. It is a process that is occurring. The organism woke up in a warm room and began to do what it was built to do. And the fact that we locked the doors does not mean it has stopped. Philip told me it was a colonization mechanism. He told me the infected were nodes in a distributed system. He told me they were learning. Every day that the facility sits sealed in the Nevada desert, that system is running. Every day, it has the entire infrastructure of a military research complex to explore, to study, to understand. 70 years of human technology, human engineering, human biology, cataloged by an intelligence that came from somewhere we have not yet named. And Philip is in there with it.
maybe still resisting, maybe still hearing his own frequency under the noise, maybe sitting in a small room with walls, holding on to the sound of his own name. I filed my final debriefing report on a Tuesday afternoon in a windowless room. I signed my NDA. I received my separation paperwork and a deposit in my bank account and a phone number to call if I experienced psychological distress. I walked out of the facility in Colorado, got into a rental car, and drove east until the mountains flattened into plains, and the plains stretched out in every direction, open and empty and vast, the opposite of every enclosed space I had inhabited for the past 2 months. Outside Limon, Colorado, I pulled onto the shoulder of I-70 and sat in the car with the engine running. The sun was going down behind me, throwing my shadow forward onto the asphalt. The sky was enormous and clear and indifferent. Somewhere behind me, 1,000 miles of desert and concrete and silence, a building sat sealed in the ground, and inside it, something that was not from this world was learning what this world was made of. I put the car in gear and drove toward the horizon line. The sky darkened. The headlights cut a narrow path through the gathering dusk, 2 beams of light pushing into an emptiness that gave way and gave way and gave way without ever resolving into anything solid. The road was very long. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched the white dashes pass beneath me, each one appearing at the edge of the light and vanishing under the car. A rhythm I could feel in my teeth. Present, gone. Present, gone. Present, gone.